Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having me here. I'm humbled and honored to be in a room of such amazing philanthropists and business associates and world leaders. So I first came to this summit probably about 4 years ago. I think I was about 35 years old. And I walked in the room, and I walked in proud and tall, and I was thinking, you know, I try to give as much of my income to charity, and I try and spend half of my time in charity. So, you know, I'm going to fit right in, and I'm going to come sit at the front table. And as soon as I heard the first panel, or I think it was Bill Gates was talking about the, $4 billion he just gave, and Warren Buffett, the $20 billion he just gave, and how everybody was kind of dedicating pretty much their entire lives to a better good, I slowly moved from the front table to where I was hiding behind the drink snack in the back of the room. But it got me to thinking, which is, what I heard and what I learned from really this summit, the Forbes 400 summit, was that it's not just about writing a check, and it's not just about showing up to a charity event, but it's actually about taking the resources that we have in our lives and utilizing those to do good, and not just thinking about it on an hour a day, but every day while you're working. How can I take what I do and use my Rolodex and use my contacts and use my business to create kind of a better life for everybody? And so that's why, for me, when I was asked to actually introduce this particular panel, creating a movement, leadership as a force for good, it was particularly appropriate, just because that's kind of, since the beginning and the first time I've come to this summit, what I've really tried to think about, in my daily life. Thinking big, thinking about how you use your assets, your money, your Rolodex, your time, whether it's fame, whether it's political or business fame, to actually make a change on a massive scale, not just on a donation by donation basis. And actually, it was because of that summit that we've spent the last few years at our company, Relativity, thinking about how can we do that. And we came up with something called the Grant, which we're very, very pleased to just be announcing, which is a show that will air on one of the primetime channels that I'm not allowed to say yet, but it's exactly that. It's a show that will put together the world's biggest philanthropists who will select social causes and give social entrepreneurs the capital to actually make that positive change, so that we can, whether it's solving hunger or helping the education crisis, or any of the things we're hearing about today, bringing up the top 20 or 30 or 40 kind of thinkers in the world in that social entrepreneurial category, and rewarding them not with, here's a check for doing good, but here's a check to actually go make a difference, and the world will get to participate via television as well. So because of that, not only am I excited about obviously the show, but more excited to introduce this panel who has been doing exactly that. Many I consider very good friends, definitely people who need no introduction, but they are the people who have been utilizing really all of their contacts, their Rolodex, their life, their brain power, and anything that they can to make a difference in the world. So starting with Jeff Skoll, who I've known for many years. We're very good friends, but Jeff is in our industry and in many industries. He started Participant Media, and I remember when he started it, it was a movie company with the goal of making movies that create social good, which is something that no one had ever done. More than that, he also has the Skoll Foundation and the Skoll World Forum, and the Skoll Center at Oxford, which really is a global umbrella for social entrepreneurism. Michael Milken, someone who also needs no introduction, who I consider to be a close friend and mentor, and I still can't figure out why, gives me advice daily and has never asked for anything. So one of the greatest business minds of our time, if not the greatest in my opinion. But also, he has given, obviously, tons to social entrepreneurism and tons to philanthropy, both in his personal cause and fight to end prostate cancer, but creating the Milken Global Conference and Faster Cures, in which I think many of us in the room here have participated in order to find cures for many diseases and improve the world health. Next to Dennis O'Brien, who also needs no introduction, via Digicel, literally has taken over the cause of the entire country of Haiti, which obviously is not just an important topic, but but one that is global sweeping change. And Steve Schwartzman, whose name is on the building that we're sitting in, he's starting a program as ambitious as the Rhodes Scholarship Program over, I think it's the chair on the far right. Which beginning in 1996 put together kind of the best of China and the US to collaborate in a global world, and was a $350 million endowment. And even our moderator, Steve Forbes, who is clearly the master at creating movements, he came very close to being the GOP presidential in 1996, which is when I got to first hear about 10% flat tax, and I still don't understand why we're not doing it. But with that introduction, it's an honor to introduce this group, and thank you again for having me, and I can't wait to hear.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for doing this. And as indicated, this panel is about individuals who have actually gone out and done things, translating intentions into real action and achieving some real effectiveness. Since Ryan has made a movie or two, had something to do with a movie or two during his career, I thought we'd start with Jeff, who has done amazing things. Before I get to what you're doing with the movies and then campaigns, a quick question. You were the first employee of eBay and therefore became president of eBay. Mm-hmm. You became a billionaire at a young age, and eBay, whatever you may think of it, really brought retailing to the masses. You made retailing like web has made everyone a content creator. You made everyone a retailer. Extraordinary social good as well as commercial. What made you do the decision to then leave something that covered all waterfronts in terms of doing good and just going into philanthropy? What made you make that decision?
So that's a quick question. Thank you, Steve. First off, it's a delight to be here. I came to this conference last year for the first time and just loved it. It's so many interesting people that care about the world, and the topics and the guests are really, really interesting. I'll try to be brief. When I was a kid, my dream was to tell stories that would make a difference in the world, that would get people interested and engaged in the big issues of the future, things that would affect us all. To our journalist friends in the audience, I didn't think that would be the best way to make a living. So I became an entrepreneur first and started a number of different companies. Coming out of Stanford Business School, I was good friends with Pierre Omidyar, who showed me his idea for what became eBay. And with my Stanford diploma in hand, I said, Pierre, that's a really dumb idea. Nonetheless, Pierre and I left our full-time jobs a few months later, and 2 years later, eBay went public, and it was a rocket ride. You know, when you do a business plan, you have a kind of a hockey stick curve, and year 5 always looks out into the stratosphere, and no business plans ever get there. We hit our year 5 numbers in year 2, and so we knew we were onto something. We were doing great, built a wonderful management team. I had a bad skiing accident and was trying to function in 100, 120-hour weeks while with a shattered vertebrae, and eventually couldn't do it anymore. And so it got me back to my dream of not just telling stories, but making a difference in the world. And so once I'd had a little time to have some surgery and recuperate, I started the Skoll Foundation, which is now the world's largest foundation in the world of social entrepreneurship. Some of our social entrepreneurs are here. Salman Khan, Wendy Kopp, I don't know if she's here, but she'll be here for dinner. Malala was here earlier. And back to the dream of telling stories, I figured more than just writing, could do film and TV. And so I started Participant Media in 2004. In the last 10 years, we've done over 50 movies, including Lincoln, The Help, Good Night and Good Luck, An Inconvenient Truth, Syriana. Long list, every film accompanied with a campaign to get people involved in the issues around the film. I'll come back to that later because I don't want to go on too long. But the decision to leave eBay was sort of made for me by my back situation. But I always had this dream of telling stories, and now that I'm doing it, I'm really happy.
You once cited the joke about the fastest way to become a millionaire in the movie business is to start with $1 billion. You saw movies not just as entertainment, but having a purpose. You insisted, now it's seen as the norm, of having an activist campaign, an activism campaign with each movie. Each movie had a purpose, and then you'd follow it through. Can you explain how you were able to make this? You had some hits. You mentioned Lincoln. You had some big draws, but you also deliberately did a couple of films like Beaver and North Country that may not have been a commercial success, but achieved a social purpose. So you're able to combine a social activism campaign and movies like Beaver, movies like North Country. Even if they weren't a commercial success, you used the commercial success of others to get social action. Talk about violence against women and fighting depression on those two and what you were able to achieve.
Sure.
This is not just a dream. You actually got something done.
Recently, I was at an event in LA, and Brian Grazer was introducing me, and Norman Lear was there, and Brian went on too long, and Norman leaned over and tapped Brian on the shoulder, and Brian was like, okay, I guess I have to stop. We should do that here. We'll call it the Norman tap. So, but the short answer to the question is we have a number of issues that we focus on, global issues ranging from the environment, oceans, nuclear weapons, pandemics, prison reform, the education system, and so on. It's kind of a long list. And for every film we do, our equation is it has to be a good story, well told, so that people will want to see it, so quality entertainment. And the commercial viability plus the social return should be greater than the resources that went into it. The film also has to have relevance today on an issue that makes a difference for a lot of people going forward. You pulled out two specific films. North Country was one of the first films we did. It was about a true story of a female iron ore miner in Minnesota who was harassed, and her case eventually led to the Violence Against Women Act. In the mid-2000s, the act was coming up for reauthorization by Congress. And we weren't sure if, in the Bush administration, if the act was going to be reauthorized. So we timed the release of the movie to the debates on the Violence Against Women Act. We had screenings on the Hill and privately with our partner, the National Organization of Women. The act passed. Many congressmen and women said it had made a difference in how they saw the issue. And we've done that many times. We timed our nuclear weapons movie, Countdown to Zero, to the New START talks a few years ago. We showed that movie at the Kremlin, at the White House, at the State Department, at the CIA, to everyone that could make a difference on the issue. And so for us, it's important that the social outcome outweighs the resources that go in. And I mentioned some of the famous films. Just a quick tidbit on two little films you've probably never heard of. Middle of Nowhere. Anybody hear of that? It's a $500,000 film that we did with an African-American female director, her first film, about a husband and wife, low income, husband goes to jail. And it was a beautiful movie. It won the Sundance Audience Award. But there was one thing in the film that caught our attention. It was $15 a minute to call the prisoner in jail. So family and loved ones would have to pay $15 a minute. So a $15 call would cost over $200. And so it was a choice between rent and food or talking to your loved one. And we know recidivism is directly correlated to the amount of exposure the prisoner has to the outside world while in jail. So we felt that was wrong. We took it up as a cause, partnered, had many private screenings, eventually got it to the FCC, who agreed with us, deregulated the monopoly, and now the prison phone rates are capped instead of $15 a minute at 15 cents a minute, saving low-income families $2 billion a year. So $500,000 film, $2 billion a year in savings. Another film called Snitch about the war on drugs, a profitable film aimed at a young urban audience, topic minimum mandatory drug sentencing laws. Up until recently, if you were caught with a certain amount of drugs, you were automatically given a minimum of 10 years in jail, no matter what the mitigating circumstances. First-time offender, nonviolent offender, the judge had no discretion. And our prisons are filled with hundreds of thousands of these young kids who made a mistake and emerged 10 years later at taxpayer expense as hardened criminals. We eventually got this to Eric Holder, who agreed with us and gave judges discretion on how to sentence. 12 states have already released a number of the people that were booked under the previous law. And we calculate that this change will save taxpayers $6 billion a year, not to mention giving new opportunities for the kids that would have been lost forever in the prison system. So there's a lot of leverage in the power of media, and thanks for letting me ramble to your quick question.
No, it's inspiring, and we don't have time to go on some of the other things you've done, like missed vaccines for swine flu and some other things, and what you're doing on Pivot and some other things. But storytelling, activism, people dream of it, and your films have won 7 Academy Awards. Been a lot of nominations, but 7 so far, right?
Yeah, we've had about 40 nominations, and we have a TV channel and 45 million homes aimed at millennials that care about changing the world and want good entertainment. 10 years from now, I expect us to be in every major country, in every major language, dealing with global issues from their perspective, from their culture, and trying to make as big an impact as possible. So, thank you.
Another long-term oriented program is Steve Schwartzman, who is introducing his, in 2016, Ryan mentioned it, the Schwartzman Scholars, and like Rhodes Scholars, but this case is focused on China. And entrepreneurs, as all of you know, sometimes are outliers. The incumbents don't see a need. The Rhodes Scholars didn't do this. The Cambridge Fellowships didn't do it, but you, the outsider, did. Why China, and what you think will be accomplished with this one-year program, looking 10 years, 20 years out as people get an immersion, not just US citizens, but some from China and all around the world. Share us the vision and how you made it a reality in China, or about to be a reality in China.
Well, a lot of these things in life, as you know, are just sort of the confluence of things that are going on in your life. And we had the good fortune when we went public at Blackstone, as people know, in 2007, that the Chinese government bought into our offering and bought 9.9% of it, non-voting stock, nice people, and didn't need a vote. So that gave us a certain familiarity. It was the first time that China had invested in a public stock of our type, really since World War II. So it was an amazing kind of paradigm shifting moment for China, and we happened to be part of it. And as a result of that, I got to meet a lot of the leaders of the country and was on the board of one of their universities, which they asked us to go on along with some other more prominent people than me. So it was quite interesting. That university was founded in 1911, they were having their 100th anniversary, and the president looked at me as a potential donor for some type of student exchange program, and I'm sure you've been identified as members of this audience for similar types of opportunities. And there was sort of the remnants of the financial crisis going on. I still work for a living, and it wasn't time for me to be diverting what I was doing. Actually, he asked in 2010, and so I just put it aside. They didn't put me aside, which happens to people, either on the podium or elsewhere in the room. And finally, they got a new president of the university. He flew to, I was in Paris, and he said, can I come to Paris and seriously talk to you about doing something? So I started thinking about what something would be. And I wasn't interested in a student exchange program particularly. I started thinking about what do I care about? And the problem that I was trying to address is what happens when you have a rising power like China and developed world powers that are having trouble with providing for their middle class, producing jobs, and basically getting more into a stalled out position. And then you have this rising power, and historically, that kind of a change creates friction. And it creates trade friction, other types of economic issues, and ultimately, from time to time, it creates military issues. And I looked at that, and I knew the people in China, and sometimes they can be misunderstood. I looked at people in around the world, and the populism was developing, as it still is. And with populism, you always need an enemy. You need someone to point out, someone you don't like, someone who, if you just go after them, your life will be fine. I think we're discovering that's not exactly the way it works. But I saw China as a logical candidate to be identified by different cultures that aren't doing as well to go after. And when that happens, my experience with the Chinese is, like most people, they don't like it. And they'll start reacting, and we'll get into a very unhappy situation with the two largest geopolitical powers in the world. So that was the problem I was interested in. And what I said is, how can I do something that'll get in the way of that, knowing the different cultures and seeing about how the world works? So what I did is I looked around for models that might work, and the Rhodes Scholarship model I thought was a terrific model. It's a great program. The kids are future leaders, and they go to Oxford, because at the time that was established, that was pretty much the center of the world. The center of the world is moving towards China, my view is that China's a core curriculum. It's not an elective course, and it certainly isn't going to be an elective course for our children and our grandchildren. And so I wanted to bring future leaders from around the world to China. I wanted them to experience the culture. I wanted them to have an unusual experience. So we're building a college like at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Yale. Courses will be taught in English, which is the global language. And we'll have 20% Chinese, 45% Americans, and 35% from the rest of the world. They'll get to meet the leaders of the country, which is pretty unusual for people that age. They'll get to get a mentor from the real world. So somebody like Jack Ma at Alibaba said, fine, I'll take a few of them. They can come to Alibaba to see how we do things. And that's not a normal experience. We'll take them around the country, not necessarily just to Shanghai and Hong Kong, and they'll be in Beijing, but the real China that most people don't get to see, secondary and tertiary cities. And they're going to know a lot when they'll leave. They'll have a dialogue, they'll have a major, they'll get a master's degree, but most importantly, they'll understand much more about it, and they'll form a network for people the age of the people on this platform, I guess, except for Jeff, really graduated from college and you had like one friend or maybe two, and you kept in touch with them and life moved on for you. In the modern world, contemporary world, you have social networks, and people can keep in touch easily forever to the extent that they want. And so I look at the Schwarzman Scholars, 200 a year, 10,000, steady state, going back to their host countries, taking positions of importance, like a Bill Clinton would out of the Rhodes, or Strobe Talbot, and a whole variety of successful people. And they have the ability to impact their countries. For those of you who travel around and you happen to be American, occasionally you go to a dinner party in a foreign country and America makes a mistake of some kind and people get angry at us. I know we're friendly and lovable. No one should get angry, but they do. And what often happens in those settings is somebody puts their hand up, because everybody at the dinner party knows each other except you knowing everybody. And they'll say, look, I went to Georgetown, I went to Harvard. Here's how it works. They didn't mean that. Let's stop getting excited about it. Let's move on. And this happens all over the world for people who went to schools here. If people can go to school at the top level in China and have that kind of experience, then the chance that there can be influence brought and misunderstandings reduce exist. And to the extent that this cohort of 10,000 people can communicate with each other, it doesn't have to be limited to China. There are many other things in the world that need to be addressed, and this would be a special group of people. So that's how I got there, Steve. And I must say, trying to do pioneering work in a culture that's never done anything like this is not for the faint of heart. You know, what you find is, you know, the entrepreneurial experience there is not exactly like it is here in China. You know, to get something to happen, you usually have to do it about 8 times. In the States, you know, when you see it, you do it, and that's that. So it really requires enormous tenacity and stick-to-itiveness, but the people who are working with you, they want this stuff to happen. They're of, you know, good spirit, and they'll make it happen. They just don't make it happen painlessly. You know, it's part of the culture.
Well, Dennis, talking about inhospitable challenges, Haiti, which had a very, it was a bloody beginning, but inspiring, the one state that did overthrow the slave uprising that worked, and but it's been 200 years of huge disappointment. Yeah. You went in that country, you brought in, for the poorest of the poor, cell phones that were affordable, but after the disaster, after the earthquake, you did more. Can you tell us what you've done in Haiti and why you think this time it might get on the right track, and what you've done to help make that happen?
You know, it's probably a terrible thing to say, but the earthquake in Haiti probably has brought about the most significant change in Haiti in its 200-year history. And I got involved in Haiti kind of accidentally. Our CEO and myself flew in there one day, got into one of these taps, drove around the place, and that was the limit of our due diligence. We went in there, invested in building a cellular network. And that was all very well and good, but at the end of the day, that, you know, if you make a large profit in a developing market, in particularly a poor country like Haiti, you know, you can go back to Ireland or go back to New York, you know, with your saddlebags full, but it's not that fulfilling in a real sense. So we set about making sort of a change and doing a different model of capitalism, and that is, you know, we're investing heavily in the country, but also we're doing a big project in terms of creating schools, building schools. We're building 150 schools, and that program will finish in September. It was part of a CGI promise and commitment. So that part of our business is actually embedded in our company in Haiti. So it's as important as our technical department, our finance department, or any other department. And we run it as if it's one of our KPIs. In other words, we build schools that are seismic proof. We train all the teachers because the teachers are not trained at all in Haiti. They're trained to 14 years of age in sort of an Irish educational system. And we then obviously put in what you'd expect in terms of internet access and many other things. But we've seen a 40% increase in terms of exam success results. So, that is one key metric. So that program will end in September, and we are still helping local community groups in all those schools. But we're now looking at what's the next big move for us. And Haiti is no different to Ireland was in the 50s. And the thing that dramatically changed Ireland was education. Only 1 in 2 children get to school in Haiti. So, a program around education is very impactful. And, there are many other organizations doing educational programs in Haiti very, very successfully. And kind of everybody is there are thousands of really great things happening in Haiti every day, both by commercial companies, but also by, US organizations as well, and a USAID. So I think a mixture of education and foreign direct investment, because of very favorable tariffing regimes between the US and Haiti, will be the kickstart. And we're seeing that already in terms of foreign direct investment in Haiti. And I think the greatest proponent of the changes that we're seeing in Haiti is obviously the work of President Clinton, because he has tirelessly worked in Haiti. For some reason, he just has a fascination about Haiti and has been heavily involved going there every couple of weeks for the last 4 years since the earthquake, trying to help change Haiti. And for the first time, Haiti has a prime minister and a president that are really good leaders. They've had a succession of absolutely awful leadership. So,
what do you think is the critical mass? You're doing a lot in schools. You mentioned others doing in schools. Where do you think it takes a critical mass where a succeeding government can't push it back? It's embedded.
I think the more and more foreign direct investment it gets, I think that makes the big change. And it's all about people keeping their promises. Post the earthquake, everybody promised. Sadly, the Europeans have not, for the most part, kept their promises, except for Spain. Brazil has been terrific. The US has been terrific. Canada. But a lot of people, put their hand up and said, here's $200 million for X, but they haven't followed through. And I like the CGI model because we run, anybody who's made a promise to the CGI on Haiti, we're meeting, for example, tomorrow in Port-au-Prince, and we have these bi-monthly meetings, and it is like, what did you promise, what did you do, and what did you deliver? And I think that is a better way of philanthropy and development than giving blind money, but you have to have the time to do that. So, I would be very positive about the changes in Haiti. I wouldn't say that lightly, and it's not because I'm an investor. I actually firmly believe that the country is on the turn. And I wouldn't believe all that nonsense in the New York Times that you read about Haiti, because they just want to dream up bad things. They're just looking for the negatives, whereas there's so many good positives that are happening.
Mike, you've done a lot in the area of fighting illnesses. Everyone wants to do that, but it's an amazing story on prostate cancer. It's personal for me as it has been for you. But it's amazing, 20 years ago, it was, in terms of fighting cancers, it was a backwater. Researchers avoided it. I don't want to use the word dead end, but it was an area that they avoided, and you profoundly changed that. How did you make that happen? The disease most prevalent among older men, and yet it had no attention, very little funding, very little research, and you almost single-handedly changed the thing. And tell us how you did it, and what kind of molds you had to break and habits you had to break in terms of research and how long it took to get something done.
Well, Steve, I don't know about old men. Can we just have young men also?
Well, it reminds me how Reagan defined his birthday. It would always be the anniversary of his 39th birthday after he got above the age of 40.
I think we're all affected by our consequences in life. And for me, the first major thing I remember was Sputnik going up in '57. And the next day I wrote a letter to the president that I wanted to lead our space program. And I was 11. And so I was responding when I saw. I don't think most people don't really remember that period of time. And I would say,
Sadly, I do.
you go back, you go 50, 100 years, it was really the turning point in many ways for Earth. And the communists thought it was their finest hour, but it was the end of communism because it woke up the United States. So I was volunteering to run our space program and headed off to Berkeley to do that. Then the Watts riots occurred. And I couldn't understand why there were riots in Los Angeles. I was home from Berkeley, and I met a young African-American man who told me he wasn't part of the American dream. It was the middle of the civil rights movement, and where you could sit on a bus or where you could go to school or where you could eat, etc. And that night I got a lesson from him that access to capital and the American dream was a civil right. So I then spent the next 25 years trying to figure out how we could create access to capital to people with ability. Later, I got involved with education because we moved 1,200 people over time to California. And I thought I took care of everything, but where their kids went to school. So we got involved in education. And we got involved with medical in '72 when my mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer, and eventually my father was diagnosed and passed away from cancer. So these sequence of events changed maybe what your action you're going to take. For me, I had a simple blood test because my good friend Steve Ross had just passed away from prostate cancer in January 1993. And I was 45 years old, and the doctor told me I was too young. I said, well, I'll just take it anyway, and discovered that I had prostate cancer. And over a series of 2 weeks, the news got worse and worse, culminating when my wife Lori and I went to visit the president of the American Urologic Association and the head of oncology urology at one of the leading science centers. He told us, as he leaned forward, that I should get my affairs in order and that we should hire psychologists for the kids. And so I had to tell him that I was going to maybe try something else first before we did that. There might be time. So I think you're thrust into it. We've been funding medical research for 20 years. We had developed all these strategies to accelerate science, et cetera. But now I had a very limited period of time. And so in answering the issues you raised, we tried to figure out how we could accelerate something immediately. Your comment, the first thing we did is we committed, at this time, $25 million immediately to prostate cancer research. And I went and visited a man named Jonathan Simons, one of the greatest young scientists in our country, at Hopkins, who was told working in prostate cancer was career suicide. So I told him, luckily, I'm here and it's not career suicide. We then had to revamp how you do research, because as you pointed out, even though it was the most diagnosed 1 in 6 men, really no one spoke about it and there was no research going on. And so we had to change the way research was going on. And one of the things we did is we told them you could just submit a 5-page paper. People actually spent, I was at Hopkins, 18 months preparing a submission to the NIH, National Institute of Health. And by the time
it took 3 years for it to happen.
18 months to prepare and 18 months for approval. So we told them, you could give us 9 feet of paper. We promise only to read the first 5, and we'll fund you within 60 to 90 days. This attracts the best and brightest to a field and we don't have to have any prior results. You give us an idea, we'll fund. The other thing that was exceedingly important and doesn't really exist in enough fields today is we told them they had to share their results. We didn't want people reduplicating efforts. As I travel around the world, you have people doing the same thing others did 5 years ahead of time. And many people told us that their work was too important. They had to wait till it was published in Nature or some important magazine. We told them we understood that. Their work were so important, we understood that. Our money was for people that work was not that important. Okay, and so others needed to share. Within 6 months, everyone agreed to share data. So the first issue was getting research and data and getting people into clinical trials. The second thing was getting the government organized. In most philanthropies, education, medical, let's take those two for starters, philanthropy is only 3%. Government, private industry, and other groups are 97%. So getting government effectively spending its money is exceedingly important. And the second thing we did is we made a promise that we would work on doubling the NIH, NCI, FDA, CDC, and National Science Foundation budgets. So I could not afford, I didn't have enough time for people to feel threatened that we were going to divert funds from breast cancer to prostate cancer. So we called the organization CAP-CURE, CA, all cancer, P, prostate cancer, cure, all life-threatening disease. Within 5 years, the government voted to double. So we've had an incremental $220 billion for research at the government level besides for philanthropy. There are so many areas that are important in generating this. I focused on nutrition and wellness. Could you change your diet? I had lost 10 relatives to cancer, and my diagnosis was worse than all of theirs. So I concluded that none of my relatives had changed their diet. If you went to the National Cancer Institute in 1993, after the cigarette companies, the people they liked least were those telling you that there's something about your lifestyle that's going to affect your health. You're dying of some disease, and it's false promises, etc. But I went to China in the mountains with the Chi doctors. I moved doctor from India in my home. I went with the Indians in the Amazon, the witch doctors in Botswana, and trying to figure out, and the healer from Russia. The only one I didn't think was effective was the healer from Russia. But I think you had to embrace these, and we're on the verge in medical science of discovering that you can actually change your genes and you can change your biome, and maybe in as little as 1 week now that we can sequence all these things. So the combination of things, these things brought to bear, and I really call it, Steve, the flicker syndrome, which I think is the most effective philanthropy. So when something flickers, sometimes it's extremely bright, and sometimes it's very dim. So you had to be very bright to mobilize 500,000 people to double the healthcare research budgets. But 2 years ago, people were so focused on Obamacare that we needed to reaffirm this country's commitment to the bioscience. And I think it's very important we understand that public health and bioscience is accountable for more than 50% of all economic growth. So if you want to talk about economic growth, you're going to talk about public health and bioscience. And so people were so confused that instead of having 500,000 people, we identified 1,000. Something that needed to be passed that my guess is we're lucky if 1% of the audience even knows about. So we needed to get past the National Center for Advancing Translational Science to move stuff from clinical into clinical from basic science faster. And so to get this thing passed, which is $600 million a year for 10 years, $6 billion, we needed to motivate the House, led by Eric Cantor at the time, motivate the Senate, led by Harry Reid, and make sure the President and the administration felt comfortable with it. So we put on one event for 3 days called the Celebration of Science to reaffirm the country's commitment to science, and shortly thereafter, It was approved by the Senate, it was approved by the House, and signed by the President. In this case, unlike the previous cases, there was really no discussion and the public didn't know. Now, it's going to affect every single person on the planet, the passing of this. So sometimes you need to be bright, sometimes you need to be dim. And if you want what Flickr stands for, quickly, F is funding, so you need proper funding. L is leadership. I is innovation and involvement. C is convening, as you've done with us today, Steve. K is dissemination of knowledge and sharing of knowledge so you don't have stuff constantly repeated. E is energizing, extremely important to energize people. And whether it was our National Educator Awards or our scholars, we needed to get them to reaffirm that what they chose in their life was the right path. And R, and most important, is recruiting. You need to get the best and brightest, whether it's running a company that Steve is going to lead. You need to get the right people in that position. So, but what I have found is sometimes the star shines so brightly that people miss the message. And sometimes having it very dim, just flickering, is the best solution.